Denver Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain, he's the team's biggest star on defense, on the entire team at the cornerback position. But the biggest question, who emerges opposite of him? The Broncos have a multitude of options, and we'll analyze every single one here on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to everybody in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, so make sure you subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day all year long as we dive deeper into our Broncos training camp position preview. The cornerback position is here. What will the 53-man roster look like? The Broncos, they've loaded up on depth at the cornerback position, new faces in town, and who can break out and emerge as a starter opposite of PS2. You get all that here on today's episode of the show. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert for OmniOrange.com. And look, Sayre, this is the one position group that I also feel like you have some questions about, but I also think there's a lot of excitement about cornerback here in Denver. Look, we know Patrick Surtain, the team's star player here on this franchise, in line here for a big-time record-setting potential contract extension this season or either after this season. He's good. He's ridiculously good, but the Broncos are trying to find somebody to emerge opposite of him. This is a big year not only for PS2, but for whoever his counterpart is opposite of him.
It's going to be a big offseason in that regard. I mean, when you talk about whoever's playing opposite Pat Surtain, that's going to have to be one of the most trustworthy guys in the defensive backfield. And the reason for that is because even though teams don't necessarily avoid throwing at Pat Surtain, like we saw over 90 targets in his direction last year, the guy that's playing on the opposite side of the field is going to get a lot more targets that direction. And so you got to figure that person that's over there, Vance Joseph, the defensive coordinator, Jim Leonard, who is defensive backs coach and pass game coordinator on the defensive side of the ball, they're going to have to be able to trust that player that's on the outside pretty consistently. And that player is going to have to be able to make a lot of plays on the football. Can't be caught out of position. Can't be caught, with the proverbial pants down over there in coverage all the time. Because look, there's going to be at least 100 to 120 targets going that direction. And so to me, this is where somebody has a chance to really step up and not just be, all right, the answer to a question, who's going to fill in or who's going to be that player opposite Pat Surtain for the Denver Broncos at corner, but be a longer term answer in terms of a fixture at this position for the Denver Broncos. Remember back when Champ Bailey came to the organization, he was such a godsend. The Broncos made the blockbuster trade to get him after getting gashed in the playoffs so many times with their defensive backfield being so terrible. And then they finally struck gold with some guys on the opposite side. The late Darrent Williams was an awesome pickup. And then they had some other players over time that finally stepped up. But it took more than just Champ Bailey being in the secondary, right? And you can have a great player on one side, but you have to have that other guy on the other side that's going to make teams pay for throwing the ball 100, 120 times in that direction.
Gone are the days of Dre Bly, Carl Payma. There's so many. Hamza Abdullah. And what is it? Andre Goodman, the list goes on and on. Denver ran into a similar situation, with Champ, in terms of just they had various guys step up over the course of the years that Champ was a member of the Broncos. And now the Broncos are needing somebody else to step up opposite of PS2. And look, I think Jim Leonard's addition to the team is a huge storyline. I think we're going to see a lot more out of Pat Surtain this year than we have so far in his NFL career, which, look, he has showcased a lot. He's a valuable player. Was last year the best year? I think when people look at, he was targeted this amount of times, it wasn't necessarily in terms of direct target coverage, especially not like he was just getting beat all the time in man-to-man. He gave up a couple of catches last year. He gave up one to Robbie Anderson against the Dolphins. It was one of those situations, it's going to happen in the NFL, but how do you respond? But then in clutch moments, like New York Jets game where he was guarding Garrett Wilson, and what was it? You had Zach Wilson throw that kind of back shoulder there, and Pat Surtain intercepted it, gave the Broncos the ball back, and all of a sudden, hey, a potential comeback was in the works there, and then We know how the rest went out there, but Pat made plays when you needed him to, but he also did it while not being able to play at his full strength in terms of what he's able to do. Like, we didn't see a lot of press man-to-man coverage from PS2 last season. We didn't see Vance Joseph put him in those situations because I'm not sure there's a real answer for it, but that's what the Broncos need to get back to, because that's what Pat wants to do. Pat wants to lock guys up the way he was in 2021 as a rookie. I mean, you're talking about going against guys like Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill. Like, you're going against some of the best guys in the game, and you're making plays. Obviously, Devontae Adams highlighted his belief in that PS2 is the best cornerback in today's game in the National Football League. That's a lot of high praise. Those guys have had some great battles back and forth in the last 2 seasons. But, who are some of these guys to emerge a little bit opposite of PS2? I think first off, we got to look at Ja'Quan McMillian. Obviously played and started in the slot last season here for the Broncos. Got reps on the outside here during OTAs and minicamp, and was a guy that I pinpoint saying, hey, Broncos country, don't be surprised if when the Broncos go their base 3-4, Ja'Quan McMillian's the starter. Like, he had a great offseason. He's got to carry that into training camp and obviously the preseason to make that come to fruition. But then there's guys like Riley Moss, Damarri Mathis, veteran Levi Wallace. If we're talking about maybe another under-the-radar young name to watch here for Broncos country, Art Green. Like, Art Green's got a little bit of a steeper climb, but Denver has options in terms of guys who can emerge to play the opposite cornerback spot of PS2. And look, I think it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all. You're going to see one guy start. I think that the Broncos and Jim Leonard are going to utilize a multitude of players rotationally this upcoming season, regardless of situation. I think we're going to see plenty of Riley Moss, Damarri Mathis, Levi Wallace, and Ja'Quan McMillian.
Yeah, and it's maybe a bit of a false equivalence here, but I'm thinking of, like, how today's NFL, you see teams that they're drafting. I think of the Green Bay Packers specifically. They draft a lot of offensive linemen with versatility, right? And they just try to get the best 5 out there. I can't help but wonder how much of that is translatable, at least logic-wise, to the secondary, where you're just trying to get the best 5 guys out there. It's not necessarily, hey, this guy's a great outside corner or this guy's a great slot corner. It's who can play anywhere and how can we get the best 5 guys out there? Because right now for the Denver Broncos, it's not necessarily just Ja'Quan McMillian, everybody is assuming he's going to stay in the slot, and he very well may stay in the slot this year. Everybody's assuming Riley Moss, if he's going to have a breakout year, it's going to be opposite Pat Surtain on the outside. But what if their roles are flipped to get the best 5 out? I mean, what if that is the best 5 combination in terms of the overall secondary? So I'm fascinated by that, and how that battle is going to develop over the course of training camp, because it does feel pretty wide open at this point when you talk about the overall depth at this position. And that's not a bad thing, right? I think a lot of times when you have a wide open position battle at training camp, it's like, well, shoot, the Broncos don't have an answer there right now. So that's obviously, that reflects negatively on the projection of that position. I think a lot of times we get caught up in the offseason of this immediate negativity when it comes to this position is unsolidified and therefore it's bad, or the projection here is not based on anything we've already seen and therefore it's bad. That's what NFL teams do all the time. They project. They have guys that, man, this guy's done absolutely nothing in the league. All of a sudden, he's a key fixture of your organization. So I think when it comes to the Broncos this year, that's where people are missing the boat a lot in terms of evaluating this roster. And I think it specifically pertains to the cornerback position as well.
Well, with the embracing of positional versatility, the Broncos, they've loaded up at cornerback in terms of starting options, potentially depth options, and guys who can still develop a little bit on the practice squad. We'll look at every single cornerback and analyze their strengths, their weaknesses, what they bring to the table here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at eBay Motors. And passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors, they've got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Once again, that's ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers.
The Denver Broncos are young, they are talented, and they are athletic at the cornerback position, even with some question marks remaining. Who are those players that make up the depth at this position? A lot of candidates to potentially start, a lot of candidates to play a lot of snaps in 2024. We're going to continue breaking down cornerback depth on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And thank you to every single one of you that listens to the show every single day. We appreciate your support of the show. And if you find value in Locked On Broncos, if you enjoy listening to the show or watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. It means so much to us for you to do that. And hey, if you're already on YouTube, check out Locked On Sports Today. You get local experts covering the teams that you love for free, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the Amazon Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today, part of the Locked On Sports Network, your team every day. And let's break down the cornerback position a little bit more. Cody, you mentioned and you name dropped a lot of the guys in segment one. Let's talk a little bit more about those players. I mean, we know this is a big offseason for Riley Moss. A team traded up for him in last year's draft, gave up a 2024 third-round pick to move up in the 2023 draft in order to get him in the mix. He's another one of those guys. He changed the jersey number. You kind of changed the vibe a little bit, feeling a little more comfortable maybe in his second season. What did you see from him at OTAs? I mean, I know there's been some dealings with injuries and things like that. Do you feel like he really does have a chance to break out this season?
Yeah, I do. And look, he had a little bit of a back flare up during OTAs. He missed a couple practices and then returned. And look, I thought he stood out. I mean, when you look at this cornerback room, we talked a lot about Ja'Quan McMillian during OTAs and minicamp because he was a consistent standout. But at cornerback, Riley was another guy who made plays on the football. Look, Josh Reynolds had the best probable overall offseason OTA program for the Broncos. At receiver, was consistent, catching everything. The Broncos went downfield to him on this one play, and Riley just played it perfectly. Got in on the hip position with his ball side hand, came forward, and knocked the pass away at the last second to prevent a touchdown. Like, it was technique. It was fundamental. He keeps everything in front of him. He never lets anybody really get behind him so far from what I've seen. He's got the ability to play inside the slot. He's got the ability to play on the outside. He's got good technique, and he's fast. Like, Riley could be one of the most underrated fast players that the Broncos have right now on their roster. He's got a lot of confidence. And look, I think the biggest thing that went against him last year is he just got hurt. I think it was the first or second day of training camp. Had the core muscle injury pop up. He had to have surgery. That led to him being sidelined throughout the season. He made an immediate impact on special teams, and wants to play more defense. He's hungry. He's chomping at the bit, and he's going to be a player that's going to get every opportunity, I think, to have a chance to emerge. But then I see a lot of people writing off Damarri Mathis. And look, Damarri had a rough sophomore year in the NFL. And look, he'll even be the first guy to tell you. I've had a chance to talk to Damarri several times. He's got a great mindset to him, a great attitude. The moment he got benched last season, he could have pouted a little bit. He could have been in the doghouse. But no, he decided to just put his head down, compete, grind, work his way on special teams to earn more reps at cornerback down the stretch last season for Denver in certain personnel packages. I know the Broncos have not given up on Damarri. Look, they understand, like, hey, he didn't have the year that they expected him to or that they wanted him to have. But 2024 is a brand new slate for him. He's going to come in. He's going to compete. He's going to be very much in the mix as well. And like I said, I think Broncos fans would be absolutely silly to discount or to write him off because he had one bad year. Like, I think a lot of people forget the impact he had as a rookie. He had to step in early on. I mean, really in week 2 against the Texans because PS2 had the shoulder injury. He came in and guarded Brandon Cooks, had a goal line pass breakup to help the Broncos win that game. And then he had, people talk about the PIs against the Chargers, but he made a lot of plays on the football and had a lot of near interceptions as a rookie during his rookie season. It's easy how quickly we forget his impact and potential that we saw on display early on, and we write it off because of a down year. I expect him to fully bounce back. He's going to be in the mix as well. But I mean, Sayre, the Broncos also went out this offseason. They added another veteran to the room in Levi Wallace, who has a lot of starting experience in the National Football League, has a lot of playing experience, has a lot of I'd say overall production in terms of passes defensed in the league. They brought him in. He's going to be an inside-outside option as well for Denver. I mean, bringing him into the mix as well. I mean, you look at Damarri having a little bit of an off year. You look at Levi Wallace, who had an off year last year. Like, this is also a chance for these guys to redeem themselves.
And it's an opportunity for the Broncos to kind of preemptively, make that move that they made last training camp when they brought in Fabian Moreau after all the injuries, right? I mean, I know that it's not the exact same situation because different guys are available at, this time of year each year. But when the Broncos were forced to sign Fabian Moreau last year, I don't know that the plan was necessarily for him to play a ton, in his first season in Denver, his only season in Denver. And he ultimately had to play because of injuries and because of Damarri Mathis struggling early on. So you kind of get out ahead of the potential with two guys that have struggled with injuries, Riley Moss and Damarri Mathis, and you bring in Levi Wallace to say, all right, we're not going to get caught in training camp without veteran option at the position, because he's really the only, other than Pat Surtain, he's really the only guy out there with a lot of experience, with multiple years of experience, right? So you have to have somebody like that. And we've seen George Paton since he came to Denver, right? He has emphasized heavily the drafting of defensive backs. That continued in 2024 with the selection of Kris Abrams-Draine out of Missouri. A lot of people felt like this was one of the better values the Broncos got in the draft, and certainly Sean Payton did his part to support that by saying the Broncos had a third-round grade on Kris Abrams-Draine. So going into the draft, you had George Paton kind of saying, like, this is not a deep draft. Like, the top half of the draft is where the value is going to be. And then the Broncos end up getting guys that they had, multiple guys. They had third-round grades on there in round 5. So I guess you just never know how the dominoes and chips are going to fall in the draft. But Kris Abrams-Draine is a player that he's not getting talked about a ton, other than the fact that he's wearing Justin Simmons' jersey number, number 31, and so he's a fascinating player as well. Like, the competition feels wide open enough that maybe he could end up playing as a rookie. I don't know that that's the expectation right now, but it certainly is not out of the realm of possibility.
No, it's not. Look, I like Kris Abrams-Draine, and you mentioned him not being talked about quite enough. I think once fans are able to see him at training camp, they're going to start talking about number 31 a little bit. And look, yeah, it's obviously different because Justin Simmons, everyone's so used to him wearing 31. We just did an episode as well talking about the Broncos safety room. Like, you can't really replace Justin Simmons, but, someone else is going to have to wear his number, unfortunately. And that'll likely change in the regular season. We'll see if that comes to fruition. But, for Abrams-Draine, like, the one thing I noticed about him, Sayre, look, he's, I think, 1 inch taller than me. I'm 5'10". I played cornerback. I played inside the nickel. I played on the outside. So he and I have a lot of, like, similarities there. We both went to Mizzou. Crazy enough there. I didn't play at Mizzou, though. So the thing I like about him, he's just a technician. He's a smart football player, and you can see it. Like, when he's working inside the slot, he understands where his help is at behind him, depending on whether they're playing man coverage or zone coverage. He knows how to use his leverage there. He understands route concepts, I think, very, very well based on receiver splits. And I think he anticipates based on, okay, well, if the number 2 receiver, which often at times is in the slot, and the number 1 receiver is on the sideline, we number from the sideline in for people who know how to, defensive backs. He just has a great understanding of being able to look or communicate to the outside cornerback if the splits between the receivers are too close. And he understands, like, hey, like, if this guy goes out, I'll take whatever's coming inside. Like, they always have, like, this good plan. He's very smart in that regard, can play press man, can play off-ball man, can play zone coverage. So he's a guy that I think will get some reps as a rookie. I think it'll be undeniable for him, but I think his best case early on here to see defensive reps is to go out there and make plays on special teams. He's going to get a lot of reps on defense in terms of the preseason. He's a name that Broncos Country needs to keep an eye on here. But some other players that we'll also touch on here, Tremont Smith, veteran guy, not really in my consideration, Sayre, to really play a role on defense. Didn't have a great preseason or training camp at corner specifically last year, but he's one of the team's better special teams players, and that's something that Mike Westhoff, Ben Kotwika, Sean Payton, they value tremendously from a personnel standpoint. So his spot may be kind of a shoe-in. There's Art Green, Reese Taylor, Quentin Newsome. Really, Art Green's the one guy out of those 3 that I mentioned that stood out, had a good offseason program. His size, I think, projects him to stay specifically on the outside. He looks much more comfortable going into the season. And obviously, Reese Taylor, Quentin Newsome, there'll also be some guys we'll talk a little bit more about coming up here in just a moment. But look, Broncos Country, projecting the 53-man roster at this position specifically is going to be tough because there is good depth on paper right now. There's young talent. There's a lot of athleticism, as Sayre alluded to earlier. Who do we have making the 53-man roster at cornerback specifically for the Broncos? We'll dive deep into that here on today's episode of the show. As we get ready to tell you who we think will make the 53-man roster at cornerback here for the Broncos specifically, just want to say thank you once again to Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team here. Sayre, diving a little bit deeper into our conversation here at cornerback. We've mentioned all the names, and obviously we'll dive a little bit deeper into why we think this position group will play out the way that you and I have it, because you and I have it really exactly the same. Ideally, Denver is going to carry, at least if we're correct, more cornerbacks on the active roster this season because of, I'd say, the emphasis on positional versatility, working inside out with the addition of Jim Leonhard, having guys do more. We see the NFL game in today's offensive structure to where you're seeing more teams go empty. You're seeing them spread you out all across the field. You need a multitude of cover guys to be able to counteract that. And there are some teams out there, and Denver's going to face quite a bit of them this year, that are going to have a lot of receiving options, that are going to try to test them at different areas of the field, different levels. And you're going to have to be able to cover them, but you're also going to have to be able to get pressure. So, if we believe the edge rusher room, the defensive line group is going to be much more improved for Denver this season, it should increase the opportunities for the cornerbacks and safeties to make more plays. So with all of that said here, you and I have the same exact roster makeup in terms of our projection. Who is making the Broncos 53-man roster at cornerback? We'll do a little bit of a deeper dive here.
Well, I think there's no doubt about PS2, Pat Surtain, obviously. There's going to be jokes made as soon as, roster cuts start coming around, Cody. It's one of my favorite things. Every year at the beginning of free agency, the beginning of the NFL draft, we get the Joker gif from The Dark Knight, right? You always saying it, here we go, right? Everybody loves to do that. And then everybody loves to take each team's best player and say, breaking news, so-and-so made the team's roster in 2024, and it'll be like Pat Surtain and Patrick Mahomes and stupid stuff like that. So if you're one of those who fires off that tweet every single year, you know what? Maybe take the year off. Okay, we get it. Pat Surtain is making the team, and so we know that Ja'Quan McMillian, I think, is a shoe-in for the roster as well. And then of course, you've got other younger guys that you've recently invested draft capital in. Riley Moss, Kris Abrams-Draine, like those guys are probably not in any danger of not making this roster. I think the final three spots that you and I have here are kind of where things get a little bit interesting, because the question, as we discussed with safety, do you keep 4 or 5 safeties? And is that dependent on whether or not you keep 6 or 7 cornerbacks? You and I both have the Broncos keeping Damarri Mathis. As we've said, don't sleep on him this season, just in case. I mean, you never know. Development and growth in the NFL, it's not always linear, right? You're going to have down years. You're going to have step back years. You might have an injury in year 2. Can you bounce back? That's the question. And the Broncos do believe in Damarri's talent. So you and I have got him making the roster. Here's the biggest question marks to me. Tremont Smith, who will contribute on special teams heavily, not just in the, coverage units, but as a return specialist potentially as well. And then Levi Wallace, who didn't exactly sign for a ton of money, less than $700,000 guaranteed. So it's not like the Broncos gave him, $1.5 million guaranteed, which would basically say you're on the team. They gave him a little under $700K. I think those are the two guys that I would say they're on the bubble at this position for me going into training camp.
No, I agree with you completely. And that's the hard part about it is, do you value your youth more than, some of your experience? Like, is your youth in a better position to step up right now and make plays versus a veteran guy? And look, Wallace, he's seen a lot of passes defense. I believe over 50-something passes defense so far in his career in the National Football League. Had a really rough year last year in Pittsburgh as a member of the Steelers. Obviously, if he's on the roster, he'll get a chance to play his former team in week 2. Tremont Smith, I agree with you. Like, those are the two question marks here, because I think you can make the case here for PS2, for J Mac, for Damarri Mathis, Riley Moss, and Abrams-Draine. Like, those are young players who I believe can absolutely make plays on the football. I think Wallace can make plays on the football, but for Tremont Smith, who hasn't really offered much at the cornerback position, like I said, going back to last year in training camp and the preseason, I mean, Sayre, he didn't make hardly any plays, and he struggled. Like, the defense that he played on last year struggled in the preseason. And for me, is Denver you have to ask the question, like for Sean Payton, George Payton, Mike Westhoff, Ben Kotwica, is his value so high on special teams that you have to keep a 53-man roster spot for him because of that at cornerback? When the reality is, like, if you lose a player, like if any of the players like PS2, Riley Moss, Damarri Mathis, whoever may be, Kris Abrams-Draine, if any of those guys go down with an injury, can you say you're comfortable with calling upon Tremont Smith to start at cornerback for you? I'm not necessarily sold on that yet. Like, that's a huge question mark to me because I don't think we have a large sample size. He hasn't historically in the NFL, he hasn't gotten a lot of opportunities to play at cornerback. And that, I think, is the concern for me. So you really don't know what you have, but what you have early on in terms of tape, it doesn't look great on film for him at corner. Is there a younger player there that maybe has an opportunity? Like for me, I could really make the case here for Art Green. Last year, Art Green, I think you could say, didn't make enough plays during training camp or the preseason as well. And he played with Tremont Smith at corner in those games. He was the other cornerback opposite of him. Tremont, I don't think is going to get to that point because of his core 4 ability. But I do think that Art Green has the ability to step in here and make plays. He looks much more comfortable defensively here. He's got good size on the outside here for Denver. And if he's coming out here in training camp, Sarah, when the Broncos are doing one-on-ones or they're doing team and they're also holding joint practices with the Packers, and Art Green is making plays on the football, let's say he gets an interception or two, but is breaking up various passes throughout the day or has good coverage, that is going to be hard to ignore here for this Broncos coaching staff. And then at that point, you also have to ask the question, okay, well, if the Broncos value Tremont Smith so highly and don't want to lose him on special teams necessarily, do you have a younger guy here who can play that special teams role? I would say right now, Riley Moss, yes, because Riley and Tremont were the top 2 gunners for the team last year. But can a guy like Kris Abrams-Draine or Art Green step up, or Damarri step up into that role as a gunner and replace Tremont Smith as a core 4 guy? That really is the question I think will answer the cornerback depth here on our 53-man roster.
And we're also going to have to see who's getting the most reps in terms of kickoff return and punt return in the preseason. I mean, I know you guys get a glimpse of that at OTAs and mini camp and things like that. And maybe training camp will shed more light on that as well. I almost wonder if Tremont Smith is in the, I know he's not this caliber yet, so nobody needs to go on and put this on Twitter or anything like that. But I almost wonder if he's in like the Matthew Slater position category in terms of your roster. I mean, he played 391 special team snaps last year, and that was without being a return specialist. And if you get upwards of 100 plus kickoff return opportunities, plus you expect at least a couple of punt return opportunities every week, so let's say 40 to 50, punt return opportunities, that's potential of 150 plus return option, snaps for players on this roster. So you're talking about nearly 400 special team snaps plus potentially another 150 snaps in the return game. I'm very interested to find out what role he's going to play in that facet, because he does have a kickoff return touchdown. And last year, or 2 years ago, excuse me, before he joined the Broncos, he had 3 forced fumbles, and so there's a lot going on with this guy that's like, man, yeah, he's not going to be the guy that you call on. Just like we never really saw Matthew Slater play wide receiver for the New England Patriots. I mean, they probably would have sooner shuttled guys up off the practice squad or what, because he wasn't really a wide receiver for them. He was more so the ace on special teams. And I think Tremont Smith fits into this category of, like, when we talk about Will Lutz and Riley Dixon and the long snapper, Mitchell Fraboni, I think Tremont Smith almost fits in this category with them as being such a specialized player that, I mean, you could see him used offensively. I mean, I don't know that that's going to necessarily happen. He's played both ways already in the NFL, and he returns kicks and punts. So I'm not saying he's this otherworldly player. He's going to be 28 years old. He's carved out a niche in the NFL, but I am interested to see, with the new rules in the kickoff return game, just how increased his role can be in that facet.
Well, and there's also some other players here that we really haven't had a chance to dive deep on as well. We're talking about guys like Reese Taylor, Quentin Newsome. Reese Taylor was on the practice squad last year. Quentin Newsome, an undrafted rookie free agent out of Nebraska. I mean, Sarah, I think with the depth as good as it is, with some of the talent that they have ahead of those guys, I just think it's going to be a hard climb for them to make the 53-man roster. But these guys are also great practice squad candidates, but they're going to have to showcase like, hey, the Broncos brought us in as undrafted guys, not necessarily Reese Taylor, but Quentin Newsome specifically. If these guys make plays in the preseason or they have like flashes here and there, it's like, okay, get back onto the practice squad, develop further, because Denver, after 2024, they're going to have 26 unrestricted free agents, and they're going to have various other free agents that are going to, team control, exclusive rights, restricted free agents, whatever you may have. Like, Denver's going to have opportunities to build this roster inward, but you have a chance to develop these guys on your practice squad as well. It makes the decisions a little bit tougher, but I feel more comfortable this year, Sayre, to be honest with you, about cornerback than I did last year. I think that Denver has some good options on the table. We'll see who makes the 53-man roster. And with that said, Broncos Country, we want to hear from you. As always, who do you think will make the 53-man roster at cornerback? Who emerges as the starter opposite of PS2? Make sure you let us know if you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening, wherever you get your podcast. But that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Our next episode of Locked On Broncos will be our final training camp position preview. The Broncos linebacker position is on deck, and it is quite arguably the biggest question mark on this team outside of who starts at quarterback. We'll break all that down on our next episode, Locked On Broncos.